So let's just pause right here. Because what's happening inside Russia tonight, inside Vladimir Putin's inner circle, isn't just another headline about sanctions or markets or some vague political turbulence. It's something far more fundamental. It's the sound, faint but real, of an empire beginning to crack. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin has built something that looked, on the surface, like a modern state, sleek, wealthy, confident. But in truth, it was never a country. It was a cartel. A pyramid of power held together not by ideology or law, but by money, fear, and silence. And the silence is breaking. Because for the first time since Putin took office back in 1999, when Russia was broke, chaotic, humiliated, we are now watching the system he built begin to consume itself. The very oligarchs who once toasted his strong leadership with French champagne in London penthouses are now trying, quietly, to get their names off the wrong lists, to keep their jets from being grounded, to keep their accounts from being frozen, to keep their families out of the crossfire. And it's not subtle. According to the EU and UK sanction registries, more than 1,800 Russian individuals and entities are now under financial restrictions. That includes virtually every billionaire who mattered to Putin's inner economy: Roman Abramovich, Oleg Deripaska, Mikhail Fridman, Alisher Usmanov, Igor Sechin. The list reads like a Forbes cover, rewritten as a police report. Together, those men once controlled about a third of Russia's GDP. Now, most can't even use a credit card outside Moscow. Here's the part that gets interesting. When those sanctions hit, when yachts were seized in Mallorca, when London froze those anonymous shell accounts, when villas in Sardinia suddenly had under investigation signs on the gates, the Kremlin brushed it off. Putin laughed. He said, "Let them eat their yachts." But the thing about oligarchs is they don't like being poor. They don't like losing status. And they don't forgive easily. For 20 years, Putin's power worked like a feudal economy in modern clothing. You didn't earn wealth, you received it as a privilege for obedience. You didn't build empires, you borrowed them from the state. It was capitalism, yes, but only for the loyal. If you crossed the boss, you lost everything. If you stayed loyal, you lived like a king. And that's the system that's starting to fail. Because fear only works when people believe the system can still protect them. Right now, that belief is gone. Look at the numbers. Since February 2022, Russia has lost more than $320 billion in foreign reserves. The ruble, once touted as the symbol of sovereignty, has dropped from 70 to over 100 per dollar, even with heavy capital controls and fake market interventions. Inflation reached 17.8% in early 2023 before Moscow stopped publishing full data. And over 1.3 million Russians, many of them engineers, doctors, IT workers, have left the country since the invasion of Ukraine began. That's not a statistic. That's a brain drain the size of an entire mid-sized European nation. The Kremlin calls this economic adaptation. That's one way to put it. Another way is collapse in slow motion. Now, for Putin, this isn't just about money. It's about identity. He spent 20 years convincing Russians that their leader, he himself, was synonymous with stability, that he alone could protect them from the chaos of the 1,990 seconds, from the humiliation of the Soviet collapse, from the decadent West. And for a while, that story worked, until it didn't. Because you can't build a national myth on imported microchips, Western credit, and yachts named Graceful and Solaris. You can't shout about sovereignty while your billionaires store half the country's wealth at offshore accounts in Cyprus, Monaco, and the Cayman Islands. That's not sovereignty. That's dependence, wearing an expensive suit. And that's the paradox catching up with Russia tonight. The country that wanted to stand alone is discovering that isolation has a price, and that price is being paid not by the poor, but by the powerful. We're now watching a slow-motion defection, not on the battlefield, but in the boardroom. When billionaires begin shifting their families to Dubai, their companies to Kazakhstan, their assets into crypto wallets in the UAE, it's not strategic relocation, it's escape. And it's not just oligarchs. Regional governors, men who once made their careers parroting Putin's slogans, are starting to murmur about economic autonomy. Defense officials are leaking frustration about supply issues. Even the Orthodox Church, one of Putin's most obedient institutions, has started speaking in careful euphemisms about the need for peace. You can hear it, the language of distance. Nobody says, "We support Putin" anymore. They say, "We support stability." That's how systems die, linguistically first, politically later. So tonight, let's be clear. This is not the end of Putin's rule, not yet. But it's the beginning of the end of the illusion that his power is permanent. Because every empire built on loyalty and fear eventually faces the same test. What happens when the fear runs out? The answer is always the same. The empire cracks. So let's rewind for a second. Because you can't understand how this whole thing is falling apart unless you understand how it was built in the first place. When Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999, Russia was exhausted. The ruble had collapsed. The state had defaulted. People weren't just poor, they were humiliated. And then came this man, quiet, disciplined, ex-KGB, who promised just one thing: order. And Russians, desperate for normalcy, gave him everything. Now, here's what Putin understood better than anyone else at that moment. In a broken country, power doesn't come from ideology. It comes from stability. And the fastest way to create stability, or at least the illusion of it, is with money. Enter the oligarchs. You remember them, the new billionaires who emerged after the Soviet Union collapsed. A handful of men who bought entire industries for pennies in the 1,990 seconds. Oil, gas, metals, telecom, banking, they controlled everything. They were rich, arrogant, untouchable, and they were hated. So Putin made them an offer. He called it the pact. Stay out of politics, keep your billions. Support me publicly, financially, symbolically. And in return, I'll protect you from the chaos. That's it. That's the system. Fear at the top, silence in the middle, survival at the bottom. It wasn't communism, it wasn't capitalism, it was Kremlin capitalism, a fusion of the two, run by one man. Putin didn't nationalize industries like the Soviets. He personalized them. Gazprom wasn't the people's company. It was Putin's treasury. Rosneft, the same. Oil, gas, aluminum, diamonds. The state didn't own them. Putin's network did. Every oligarch, every regional governor, every CEO owed his life literally to the Kremlin's favor. You think that's an exaggeration? Ask Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man. He dared to criticize Putin on television in 2003. Within months, he was arrested, his company Yukos dismantled, and he spent 10 years in a Siberian prison camp. That was the message: step out of line and I erase you. And it worked. For almost 2 decades, Putin's Russia looked on paper like a success story. GDP doubled. Moscow gleamed with skyscrapers. The middle class grew. Western companies flooded in. The 2000s were a golden decade for Russian wealth. But beneath that glossy surface was something rotten. No innovation, no competition, no rule of law. Every major contract went to a friend, a cousin, or a loyalist. The Russian economy wasn't developing, it was extracting, sucking wealth out of natural resources and redistributing it upward. By 2018, nearly 60% of Russia's exports came from oil and gas alone. Half the federal budget came from energy revenues. And when you're that dependent on one thing, you're not running a country. You're running a gas station with nuclear weapons. But here's the trap. That system only works as long as the money keeps flowing. And when it stops, when oil prices crash, when sanctions bite, when war isolates you, the system doesn't just slow down, it collapses. Because loyalty built on profit has an expiration date. And Putin, the so-called master strategist, built his empire on rent-seeking, not creation. He turned Russia's brightest minds into bureaucrats. He turned its richest entrepreneurs into courtiers. And now he's running out of both. That's what makes this moment so dangerous. The oligarchs aren't leaving because they grew a conscience. They're leaving because they finally understand the deal they made. They traded freedom for protection, and now there's no protection left to buy. So, what happens next? When the billionaires start running, the mid-level officials start whispering, and the propaganda stops convincing, the fear pyramid starts to wobble. The question isn't if it falls, it's who gets crushed when it does. Because in the Kremlin system, the end always comes from within. Not with riots in the street, not with a revolution, but with a phone call that suddenly goes unanswered, with a meeting that doesn't get scheduled, with silence where there used to be applause. That's how power dies in Russia, quietly, bureaucratically, and then all at once. And the irony, Putin once promised to end the chaos of the 1,990 seconds. But by building his empire on corruption, loyalty, and fear, he's recreated it inside the palace walls. So let's talk about when the cracks actually started to show. Because from the outside, Russia still looks solid. Putin was still on television every night, surrounded by generals, priests, and billionaires nodding in unison. But behind the cameras inside the ministries, the banks, the oil companies, you could feel it. That slight shift in tone, the nervous glances, the silence when his name came up in meetings. That's how it starts. Not with a coup, not with a bang, but with hesitation. See, the first real fracture appeared not on the battlefield, but in the spreadsheet. Because every dictatorship, no matter how loud, eventually runs into math. And in Putin's case, the math stopped working. By mid-2022, Russia's so-called war economy was already cannibalizing itself. Factories that made car parts were suddenly making drones. Shipyards meant for civilian trade were redirected to military logistics. The Kremlin began calling this import substitution, which sounds fancy, right? Until you realize it means we ran out of stuff and now we're improvising. Take aviation. Before the invasion, nearly 80% of Russia's commercial fleet depended on Western-made parts, Boeing, Airbus, Rolls-Royce. After sanctions hit, maintenance stopped. By 2024, Russian airlines were dismantling their own grounded planes just to keep others flying. You can't run a modern economy by stripping of your own assets for parts. Then came the financial spiral. When the EU froze those $300 billion in central bank reserves, Moscow called it theft. But let's be honest, it was containment, because that money wasn't just sitting in vaults. It was the oxygen of the Russian state. The reserves backed the ruble, paid for imports, and subsidized energy discounts that kept ordinary Russians quiet. Cut that off, and you cut the bloodstream. So the Kremlin improvised. They printed rubles. They forced exporters to convert their foreign currency into state accounts. They banned citizens from buying dollars or euros. In short, they built a financial prison and then locked everyone inside. But here's the thing about prisons. People find ways to escape. According to the Bank of Russia, private capital outflows exceeded $250 billion between 2022 and 2024, the highest in 2 decades. That's money running away quietly through shell companies, crypto wallets, and whatever flights. We're still leaving Moscow. And where did it go? Not to Europe, too risky, to Turkey, to Dubai, to Yerevan. Entire Russian neighborhoods have now popped up in Tbilisi, Georgia, where cafes serve borscht under signs that say, "No politics, please." That's not exile, that's evacuation. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the propaganda kept insisting everything was fine. The TV anchors smiled, the graphs went up. But on the ground, groceries doubled in price. Imported medicine disappeared. In one survey quietly circulated among Moscow doctors in early 2024, more than 40% said they could no longer access key Western treatments for cancer and heart disease. And that's not just statistics, that's life expectancy. So while Putin was promising a resilient economy, his country was literally dismantling itself piece by piece. And the oligarchs, remember them? They started doing what oligarchs always do when the ship starts sinking. They lied, they flattered, and they hid their gold. Roman Abramovich sold Chelsea Football Club a sale that raised over $3 billion and claimed the proceeds would go to humanitarian relief. The UK government froze the fund. Oleg Tinkoff, founder of Tinkoff Bank, called the invasion insane, and within 48 hours, he was forced to sell his entire bank stake for a fraction of its value and flee the country. You think that's coincidence? These are men who once defined power in Russia. Now they can't even define where they live. By late 2024, dozens of former Putin loyalists had been found dead under what officials politely call mysterious circumstances. Falls from balconies, sudden heart attacks, yacht accidents, even suicide notes that read like they were written by a lawyer. At least 30 prominent businessmen connected to the energy sector have died since the invasion began, an astonishing number for any country, let alone one that keeps saying everything is under control. You see the pattern? This isn't stability. This is panic, dressed in ceremony. Because when the powerful start dying under strange conditions and the survivors start whispering about who's next, it's no longer loyalty keeping the system together. It's paranoia. And paranoia doesn't build nations. It destroys them. Let's pause for a second. Imagine being a Russian bureaucrat right now, your savings in rubles that lose value every week, your boss under investigation, your children studying abroad under fake last names. You'd start thinking the unthinkable. Maybe it's time to step back. Maybe it's time to talk. Maybe it's time to survive. That's the mindset spreading through the Russian elite tonight. Not resistance, not rebellion, self-preservation. And when self-preservation becomes the dominant ideology in a dictatorship, the dictator's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. So let's talk about what happens when the people who built your empire decide it's time to leave it, because that's exactly what's happening in Russia right now. And you can call it whatever you want: relocation, asset protection, temporary withdrawal. But let's be honest, this is a flight, a mass exodus of billionaires, bankers, and corporate elites. The same men who, for 20 years, toasted Putin's power and filled his war chest are now packing up their fortunes and vanishing into private jets, encrypted accounts, and legal loopholes. This isn't theory. It's happening in real time. Since 2022, more than 60 of Russia's top business figures have either left the country or transferred their primary residence abroad. You can track it in property records, offshore filings, and even school enrollments, because when your children suddenly start showing up at Swiss boarding schools under new family foundations, it's not exactly subtle. Dubai, Yerevan, Astana, Istanbul, they've become the new Moscow suburbs. You walk into certain restaurants in the UAE, and the waiters don't speak Arabic. They speak Russian. Private jets landing at Yerevan airport have tripled since the first wave of sanctions. And according to customs data leaked in 2024, Russia imported over $20 billion in luxury goods last year through parallel channels. Translation? They're smuggling their comfort. But it's not just about lifestyle. It's about fear of being the next name on that list. Because if you're an oligarch and you watched what happened to Tinkov forced sale, or Avon and Friedman assets frozen, or Usmanov yachts seized, villas locked, accounts blocked, you start realizing the deal is off. Remember that unwritten pact? You stay loyal, you stay rich. Well, the loyalty's still required, but the richness? That part's over. One by one, they're cutting the cord. In London, law firms specializing in asset recovery are quietly managing the divorces, citizenship changes, and liquidations of sanctioned tycoons. In Dubai, Russian billionaires are opening companies under their wives' or nephews' names. And in Kazakhstan, brand new financial institutions have popped up with anonymous ownership structures, Russian money in Kazakh clothing. It's a shell game, a desperate global shell game to outrun the consequences of their own creation. And yet, here's the part that still shocks me. Even now, as they flee, none of them will say the name. Not one of them will say the words, Putin is the problem. They'll say the situation. They'll say the circumstances. They'll say geopolitical instability. But they won't say the man, because even in exile, the fear still works. It's psychological, a trauma loop built over 2 decades of dependence. These men owe everything they have, every dollar, every villa, every privilege to Putin's favor. And now they're learning the hardest truth of all. When you build your fortune inside a dictatorship, you don't own your wealth. You rent it, and the rent's due. Let's put this in perspective. Before the invasion, there were 125 Russian billionaires on the Forbes list. As of 2024, there are 88. That's not because they all went broke. It's because much of their money is frozen, hidden, or under investigation. Dozens of private jets seized. More than $20 billion in luxury assets, yachts, villas, jets, confiscated or immobilized under EU and US sanctions. And here's the irony. The same West they ridiculed for moral decay is now the only place with laws strong enough to stop them from losing everything to each other. Meanwhile, back in Russia, the next generation of elites, the mid-tier bankers, the deputy ministers, the tech founders, they're watching all this and taking notes. They're transferring money to Armenia. They're setting up backups in Kyrgyzstan. They're quietly applying for residency in Dubai or Cyprus because they know how this story ends. They've seen it before in Libya, in Iraq, in Venezuela. When the elite starts running, the regime's half dead. But here's the thing. Putin knows this too, and he's furious. That's why, in late 2023, the Kremlin began passing laws requiring repatriation of capital. It means bring your money home or we'll make you regret it. And they have. Executives questioned, passports seized, exit visas denied. Even rumors of new exit taxes for billionaires leaving Russia, a tax on escape. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. So what you have now is a fractured elite, half terrified of the West's sanctions, half terrified of Putin's revenge, and all of them running. Because deep down, they understand something the propaganda can't hide anymore. You can control the media. You can control the courts. You can even control the elections. But you can't control capital. Money always finds the exit. And once the money leaves, the loyalty follows. This right now is the beginning of the end of Putin's power base. Not the army, not the protests, the accountants. Because when the people who funded the regime start unplugging their accounts, transferring assets, liquidating real estate, you're not dealing with dissent. You're dealing with abandonment. And no empire, no matter how brutal, survives the moment its builders start walking out the door. So, you know how every regime likes to pretend the economy's fine right before it collapses? Yeah, that's where we are. The official story from Moscow tonight is that Russia's economy has adapted to sanctions, adapted to war, adapted to isolation. But let's be honest, that's not adaptation. That's survival mode. Because what's happening inside Russia's economy right now isn't resilience, it's triage. The Kremlin is patching holes faster than it can count them, printing money, forcing businesses to sell dollars, faking statistics, even rewriting unemployment reports to keep up the illusion that everything is steady. But the data, the real data, tells a different story. Inflation? Officially around 8%, but independent analysts like the Russian Economic Freedom Foundation estimate it's closer to 17% in major cities. Food prices have doubled in some regions. Eggs, yes, eggs went up 45% in a single year in a country that used to export grain. And the ruble? Well, the ruble is no longer a currency. It's a mood ring green one day, red the next. The central bank has spent billions propping it up while quietly restricting how many dollars Russians can legally buy. Try to move your savings abroad, and the state freezes your account for national security reasons. Sound familiar? That's not an economy, that's a hostage situation. Factories once producing electronics or cars now churn out military gear. By 2024, more than 1/3 of Russia's industrial output was linked directly to defense contracts. They call it mobilization. But what it really means is this. The entire economy has been converted into an arms factory. And that comes with consequences. Civilian production, down. Imports, down. Consumer confidence at its lowest point since the 1998 financial crisis. Meanwhile, hospitals can't get Western medicine. Universities can't access research software. Airlines are flying Frankenstein planes aircraft kept aloft by cannibalizing others for spare parts. In Moscow alone, at least 60 passenger jets have been grounded indefinitely due to lack of components. And the Kremlin calls this self-sufficiency. You think that's strength? No, that's desperation with a PR department. But let's talk about something Putin never mentions: people, the human part of the collapse. Since the invasion began, Russia has lost more than 1 million skilled workers, engineers, IT specialists, doctors, architects. Not killed in war, gone, left, a silent migration of brains and hands that kept the system running. And they're not coming back. They're working in Berlin startups, building code in Tbilisi, teaching in Warsaw. They're free, and Russia, stripped of its innovators, is aging faster than ever. The average Russian scientist is now over 50 years old. And entire research sectors, biotechnology, aerospace, AI, are collapsing for lack of staff. So, what's the Kremlin doing? They're importing workers from Central Asia and drafting young men from the provinces to fight or to fill the labor gap. That's not a policy. That's a last resort. Meanwhile, the government keeps pouring trillions of rubles into the war. Over 6% of GDP now goes to defense spending, the highest share since the Soviet Union. Education, healthcare, infrastructure all gutted. If you're a Russian teacher, your classroom budget is cut in half. If you're a doctor, your hospital gets fewer supplies but more wounded soldiers. And the propaganda says this is patriotic sacrifice. Sure. But it's also economic suicide. Because a war economy doesn't grow, it devours. And eventually, it runs out of things to eat. And here's the irony. The same oligarchs who once bragged about sovereign wealth now have to sell their assets to pay salaries. The once proud Gazprom has lost nearly 70% of its European revenue since 2021. Rosneft can't sell oil freely. It hides it through shadow fleets, sailing under flags of convenience. That's not global power. That's smuggling at scale. The deeper truth? Russia's not decoupling from the global economy. It's being cut out of it. And the country that once claimed to be energy independent now depends on China for cars, on Iran for drones, and on North Korea for ammunition. That's not sovereignty. That's dependency in disguise. So while the Kremlin tells its citizens they're standing tall, the numbers tell us something else. GDP growth of less than 1.5%, currency reserves dwindling, life expectancy falling, and a generation that stopped believing the future will get better. You can't bomb your way into prosperity, you can't censor inflation, and you can't keep calling a dying economy a victory. So tonight, as Putin claims that Russia is stronger than ever, the truth is, it's hollow. Because no matter how many parades you throw or maps you redraw, the laws of economics don't salute the flag. They just add up until they don't. So let's talk about fear. Because for 20 years, that was Putin's greatest weapon. Not tanks, not missiles, not propaganda, fear. The kind that seeps into the bones of a society until silence feels safer than truth. Until you learn to look down when you walk past a police checkpoint. Until you stop saying names out loud. That fear, the one that held Russia together for 2 decades, is breaking. You can see it in the cracks of the state machine. In the tone of the news anchors who used to grin while reading Kremlin scripts, in the cautious language of bureaucrats now saying the government instead of the president, in the whisper networks of parents terrified their sons will be drafted and who, for the first time, are saying it out loud. Because here's the thing. Fear only works when people still believe it protects them. Once it stops working, once the punishments stop making sense, it collapses under its own absurdity. And that's exactly what's happening inside Russia tonight. When you have to arrest your own war bloggers for undermining morale, when you have to fine your priests for using the word peace, when you have to censor the word war itself, you're not projecting power. You're broadcasting weakness. The Kremlin still pretends it controls the narrative. State television pumps out its daily message. Everything is going according to plan. But then there's the internet, the one battlefield the regime never fully conquered. Despite censorship, VPN use has tripled since 2022. Millions of Russians are watching Ukrainian videos, reading Western media, scrolling through Telegram channels run by exiles in Riga, Tbilisi, Warsaw. The truth, messy, chaotic, undeniable, is seeping in. And you can't bomb the internet. Meanwhile, the war that was supposed to be over in weeks is now dragging into years. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, tens of thousands of missing soldiers. And every time a mother receives another sealed coffin marked training accident, the propaganda dies a little more. Even the police, the army, the FSB, the enforcers of fear are losing faith. You see it in the corruption cases, in leaked recordings of officers complaining they haven't been paid, in regional governors begging for reinforcements that never arrive. Because when fear stops rewarding obedience, obedience disappears. And so Putin does what every autocrat does when control slips. He tightens the grip. New laws criminalizing discrediting the army, fines for foreign speech, threats of prison for fake news. But here's the paradox. The harder you squeeze, the faster people slip through your fingers. The propaganda can't keep up anymore. Remember, this was once the most sophisticated media machine in the world. Slick graphics, emotional appeals, endless talk shows. Now it's pure noise. The same faces shouting the same lines, the same tired slogans about NATO aggression and Western decadence. But even the audience is shrinking. Independent surveys, yes, the few that remain show that trust in state TV has fallen from 80% in 2015 to barely 40% in 2024. And that's before you count the millions who've tuned out completely. Because at some point, people just stop listening. You can jail opposition leaders, you can ban newspapers, you can poison critics, exile journalists, threaten families. But you can't force a nation to keep believing in a lie once they've tasted the truth. And here's the irony that history keeps repeating. The same fear that once stabilized the regime now accelerates its collapse. Because when everyone's afraid, the oligarchs, the generals, the ministers, the secretaries, no one moves, no one decides, no one risks being seen next to the wrong person. And in that paralysis, the system begins to die. So yes, Putin still sits in the Kremlin. Yes, the parades still march, the anthems still play, the talking heads still smile. But behind the facade, the fear that once kept everyone in line has turned inward. It's not fear of the enemy anymore. It's fear of each other. That's what decay looks like from the inside, not explosion, implosion. A slow, bureaucratic suffocation where power exists only on paper. Let's be honest. You don't need tanks in the streets to know when a regime is dying. You just have to watch who stops pretending. And right now, in Russia, people are starting to stop pretending. They're whispering again. They're laughing quietly at propaganda segments. They're buying one-way tickets out of Moscow. And they're starting to imagine, just imagine what life might look like without the man who taught them to be afraid. Because once the fear breaks, it doesn't come back. So what happens when the world's self-proclaimed indispensable strongman starts losing control? When the aura of invincibility begins to fade not just at home, but abroad. Because make no mistake, what's collapsing in Moscow tonight isn't just a government, it's a geopolitical illusion. And the shockwaves are being felt from Beijing to Berlin. For 2 decades, Putin played the role of global disruptor. He sold oil to Europe, weapons to the Middle East, and fear to everyone else. He convinced the West he was untouchable, that Russia, no matter how corrupt or isolated, would always be too dangerous to confront directly. That myth is over. The invasion of Ukraine, meant to prove Russian power, has done the opposite. It exposed how fragile that power really was. The army that was supposed to take Kyiv in 3 days can barely hold its own positions after 3 years. And the economic sanctions dismissed at first as ineffective are now cutting deeper than even the Kremlin admits. You can see it in the alliances. China, Russia's so-called no limits partner, has quietly pulled back. Yes, they'll buy cheap oil. Yes, they'll sell spare parts. But politically, Beijing has gone silent. No more talk of strategic friendship, no more shared stage, because who wants to tie their global brand to a collapsing client? Even India, once eager to balance between Moscow and Washington, is shifting. Indian imports of Russian crude are high, but the payments? Delayed. The rupee trade scheme failed. And behind closed doors, New Delhi diplomats now talk openly about a post-Putin Russia. And then there's Europe. Remember those endless winters when Europe froze in fear of losing Russian gas? That era is gone. In just 2 years, the EU cut its dependence on Russian energy by nearly 90%. Liquefied gas from the US, renewables, and new pipelines from Norway and Azerbaijan have filled the gap. And guess what? The lights stayed on. That was Putin's biggest miscalculation. He thought Europe couldn't live without him. He was wrong. Now it's Russia struggling to live without Europe. Meanwhile, NATO, the alliance Putin called obsolete, has grown stronger. Sweden and Finland joined. Ukraine is closer to NATO integration than ever before. And countries that once stayed quiet, the Baltics, Poland, even Czechia, are now leading the moral argument against dictatorship. In trying to divide the West, Putin accidentally rebuilt it. But here's the real twist. The collapse of fear inside Russia is now spreading outward. Authoritarian leaders who once admired Putin's control from Budapest to Caracas are suddenly reconsidering their own mirrors. Because if he can fall, anyone can. And this isn't just symbolic. The global economy is feeling the tremors. Russia's share of global trade has shrunk to less than 1.8%, the lowest in modern history. Its currency has been downgraded to junk by every major ratings agency. And its population aging, shrinking, and disillusioned faces the same demographic implosion that killed the Soviet Union. Let's pause there for a second. Because history doesn't just rhyme here, it echoes. In the late 1980 seconds, when the USSR began to crumble, it wasn't because of ideology, it was because of arithmetic. Too many wars, too few friends, too much fear, not enough future. And that's exactly where Russia stands again tonight. Only this time, the rest of the world isn't panicking. They're adapting fast. The European defense industry is booming. Ukraine is now producing drones that rival Western models, and global energy markets have moved on. There's no going back to the old order. So when Putin threatens, when he blusters about red lines and nuclear deterrence, it doesn't carry the same weight it used to, because credibility once lost is hard to rebuild. The Kremlin still insists Russia is winning. But outside that bubble, the truth is painfully clear. Russia has become what it once mocked, a sanctioned, paranoid, economically dependent state, a country that trades fear for survival. And as the world adjusts, one question quietly hangs in the air. When a regime built on intimidation loses its ability to intimidate what's left. So, let's take a breath. Because at this point, after everything we've seen, the exodus, the sanctions, the censorship, the fear, the silence breaking, it's worth asking, what exactly are we witnessing here? Is it just the decline of one man? Or is it something larger, something historical, maybe even inevitable? Because if you look closely, the story of Vladimir Putin isn't new. It's old, ancient even. Empires built on control don't collapse because someone beats them in battle. They collapse because they start lying to themselves. They believe their own myths. They confuse fear with loyalty, wealth with power, and silence with stability. And then one day, the silence cracks. That's what's happening right now inside Russia, a reckoning with the myth of invincibility. For 20 years, Putin sold his country a story that order mattered more than freedom, that power meant safety, that Russia was rising from its knees. And for a while, people believed it. But belief, like oil, runs out. The empire of control has hit its natural limit. And if history is any guide, this is where the most dangerous phase begins. Because when autocrats fall, they don't just lose power, they lose the narrative, and they fight like hell to get it back. We've seen this movie before. Stalin's paranoia devouring his own inner circle. Brezhnev's stagnation turning victory parades into funerals. Even the czars clinging to divine destiny while the streets outside froze with hunger. The costumes change. The script doesn't. And now, Putin's Russia has entered its own final act, a regime obsessed with rewriting the story even as the plot unravels. But here's the thing, no dictator ever prepares for. You can control people's fear for a lifetime. You can control their hope for maybe half that. But you can't control their exhaustion. Because exhaustion, quiet, invisible, moral exhaustion is what kills authoritarianism. Not revolutions, not protests, just the collective decision to stop pretending. And that's what this reckoning really is. Ordinary Russians, the teachers, the mothers, the soldiers, the engineers, they've lived through this before. They've buried empires before. They know the sound it makes when power runs out of lies. It doesn't explode, it fades. And one day, the portrait on the wall, the one that used to hang in every office, every school, every police station, comes down quietly. Without ceremony, that's how it ends. Now, let's be honest. Putin will try to rewrite this ending. He'll blame the West. He'll blame traitors. He'll claim he was betrayed. That's what strong men do when strength fails. But the truth is simpler. The system that Putin built, the cartel, the illusion, the empire of fear, was never designed to survive him. He made sure of that. He wanted to be indispensable. And now he is to the collapse. The tragedy, of course, is not his downfall. It's the price his people will pay for it. Because every authoritarian era ends the same way. The ruler walks off stage, the people clean up the rubble, but maybe, and this is the fragile hope buried inside all this darkness, maybe this time Russia won't rebuild the same walls again. Maybe it will remember what happens when power goes unchecked. Maybe the next chapter won't start with another strongman, but with a simple idea that strength isn't silence, that patriotism isn't obedience, and that truth, even whispered, is stronger than fear, shouted through a megaphone. That's the reckoning, not the fall of one man, but the moment a nation realizes it deserves better. So let's go back to where we started. 2 decades ago, Vladimir Putin promised Russians he would make their country strong again. And in a way, he did. For a while, the lights came back on. The salaries rose. The chaos of the 1,990 seconds faded into memory, and people tired, humiliated, hopeful, traded their freedom for a promise. Never again will we fall apart. But that promise, like all promises built on control, came with a price. Because strength that depends on fear isn't strength, it's paralysis. And tonight, that paralysis is breaking. The oligarchs have fled. The ruble is hollow. The propaganda has turned from triumph to noise. And even the silence, that heavy, disciplined Russian silence, is beginning to sound different. Less obedient, more tired. You can feel it in the cafes, in the metro cars, in the quiet jokes told under breath, that strange electric space between cynicism and courage. It's not revolution, it's awakening. And if you know Russian history, you know that awakening always begins this way. Not with slogans, not with riots, but with the smallest act of disobedience, a whisper, a laugh, a question too honest to stay unsaid. That's how power unravels. Not when the opposition wins, but when the population stops performing fear. And maybe, just maybe, that's what's happening now. We've seen this cycle before. Czars, commissars, general secretaries, all men who believed they were the state itself. And all of them discovered the same truth. The state outlives the man, but only when the man lets it breathe. Putin never did. He smothered it with loyalty, propaganda, and myth. And now, as that myth collapses, the air is rushing back in. It's messy, it's painful, it's dangerous, but it's also necessary. Because history doesn't move in straight lines, it exhales. And tonight, Russia is exhaling after 20 years of holding its breath. The question is, what comes next? Will it rebuild the same fortress of fear under a new face, a new name, a new flag? Or will it finally break the cycle that's haunted it for centuries? A cycle of power mistaken for protection, of leaders who promise greatness and deliver grief. I don't know the answer. No one does. But I know this. Every time Russia faces that choice, the world holds its breath with it. Because the fate of that country, a country of poets, of soldiers, of survivors, has always carried a warning for the rest of us. That warning sounds something like this. When power becomes theater, when truth becomes optional, when fear becomes routine, collapse isn't a question of if, it's a matter of when. And tonight, as the lights flicker across Moscow, as the elite scatter and the people quietly endure, we are watching that when unfold in real time. So yes, the empire is cracking, but history might finally be learning. And if that's true, if even for once the cycle breaks, then maybe, after all this darkness, there's a chance, however small, that Russia's next strongman won't be a man at all, but an idea. That freedom is not chaos, that truth is not weakness, and that silence is not safety. Because in the end, every empire falls the same way from the inside out, and always right after it stops listening.